All right. Good morning, everyone. It is 10 a.m. We're going to go ahead and get started. It is great to see everyone this morning, or at least your names on our call roster. We have quite a few people joining us for this Denver Museum of Nature and Science virtual field trip, Scientists in Action, Ancient Mummies, New Discoveries. I'm your host today. My name is Kate. I'm the virtual programs coordinator here at the museum. And I'll be acting kind of as a facilitator, connecting you and your questions to our guest of honor, Dr. Michele Koons, who's one of our archaeologists here at the museum. A couple housekeeping things I'd like to take care of before we jump into our very exciting broadcast. First and foremost, we'd like to respectfully acknowledge that the Denver Museum of Nature and Science is built upon lands traditionally stewarded by the Cheyenne, Ute, Arapaho, and Oshate-Shakoan tribes. Likewise, we have students joining us today from not only the state of Colorado, but in fact, states of, it looks like Utah, Indiana, and potentially Washington. So thank you so much for joining us this morning and giving us your time. We have a very cool broadcast, and I know both Michele and I are thrilled to have you here. One thing I'm going to ask for our on-camera crew, and it looks like they're already doing it, so they kind of know the drill, but if you could keep your mic muted just until we're ready for that question and answer session, about 15 or 20 minutes. I'll let you know when the time is here, and I'll call you on, and we can get you pinned on screen and get your questions going. If you have questions and you are not going to be on camera today, totally fine. In fact, we're going to have you just type them in the chat, and I'll help kind of facilitate those, and Michele will answer them as well. One thing I would like to do a quick disclaimer on, it probably goes without saying, but we are talking about mummies today, which means there will be some imagery of human remains and deceased bodies. We just felt it would probably be more graceful and sensitive if we let you know in advance. Sometimes this can be triggering or unsettling for people. So how you process this with the adults you're watching with today, we're going to leave to your discretion. But ultimately, we just care that everyone here is feeling safe, comfortable, and really excited to learn. So without further ado, I'm going to introduce our host in just a second, Dr. Michele Koons, or Michele. She's very smart. She's very well researched. She's done a ton of work in the field, not in the United States alone, but other countries as well. In fact, she's such an expert as far as mummies go. She wrote a book with another scientist. I think she'll be talking a bit about it today. So hello, Michele. Good morning. What would you like to tell us about yourself, mummies, and archaeology?
Where we're going to chat a little bit about mummies. So, like Kate said, I am the curator of archaeology here at the museum. And what this means is that I get to do all kinds of really cool things. I do field work where I actually lead excavation projects, and I do projects where we do survey work, where we walk and we try and find archaeological sites in places that are probably haven't been explored in that way for many, many years, if maybe sometimes ever. And then I get to work here in our collections. We have a really incredible archaeology collection at the Denver Museum, and get to do different kinds of research on those materials. And I get to do things like this and talk with all of you. So I have a very fun and exciting kind of background. I'm actually headed to, a lot of my fieldwork is in Peru, and I'm actually headed to Peru on Saturday to start a new project there. So should be really exciting. But first, I wanted to what first I should say what we're here to do today is talk about mummies. So first thing is, what is a mummy? And this is pretty much any body. It could be human, it could be animal, any kind of animal that the parts of the body like the skin and the hair, the organs are preserved. If those parts don't preserve, we consider that to be a skeleton. But when they're preserved, we consider that to be a mummy. And so, right off the bat, what I'd love to do is put up a poll to quiz all of you and to try and understand how mummies are formed. And so you have a couple options here to choose from. We're going to throw the actual poll up there: by extreme heat or cold, by lack of oxygen, by embalming and preservation through embalming, or all of the above. And we'll give you a few minutes here. Right, there's some answers coming in. Teachers can ask your students what they think.
So it looks like we can go ahead and end our poll, share the results. For the most part, everyone chose all of the above. We had one class opt for by extreme heat or cold. So Michele, who is right? Are we all right? What's the deal with this?
You are all right. That's great. Yes, everyone is right because it is all of the above. And now I'd like to take some time to talk about this and to explain really how mummies are formed. And I want to almost preface that with mummies are found throughout all over the world because of these varying methods of ways that their bodies are preserved. So the first is through what we call spontaneous preservation. And this here, if you're looking at the screen in the photograph, there's a various ways that that spontaneous preservation can occur. In this upper left-hand picture, this is by very dry desert environments. And so this is a picture from Egypt, and this is from before Egyptians started to do the mummies that we're all familiar with and that we're going to be talking a lot about today. And this is just a body that preserved because of that dry desert heat. Um, what we'll see here on the right side of on the upper picture, this is a bog body, and these are found mostly in northern Europe, so in parts of England and parts of like Scandinavia. And these are bodies, oftentimes some of these are over 2,000 years old, that were maybe a prisoner or somebody that like sometimes like murders happened, and often other times people would fall into what are called peat bogs. And peat bogs are kind of swampy environments that have no oxygen, and they also have lots of what are called tannins, and the tannins are what are used to make leather. So essentially these people turn into leather, and are preserved for many years. And then the bottom picture here, this is a really famous mummy. This is the Iceman. And so, as the name implies, this was a frozen mummy. And this person was found in the 1990s eroding out of a glacier in the Austria Italian border area. He was over 5,000 years old, and we could even see what remains of his final meal. I do note, though, like I think it's kind of interesting about this particular mummy and any of the frozen mummies is once they're found and they're brought into an area that's not frozen, they start to decay to turn into, like we were saying, skeletons. So this mummy needs to constantly be kept in a freezer, which is not necessarily the case for the dry bodies. They pretty much stay. So we can go to the next slide here. I want to talk about a couple other of these mummies. The top one, this is a mummy that was preserved by the dry desert heat in China. So again, we're talking about all over the world, and you can see this mummy is well over 2,000 years old and the preserved absolutely perfectly because of that dry environment. And on the bottom is a much more recent mummy. This is a woman from Philadelphia, actually, and she passed away in the 1800s and was buried in a cemetery. And the chemicals and the different microbes and the biology of the soil basically ended up turning her body to soap. So it's called adipose, but she's known as the soap lady because of this chemical reaction, but she is also preserved quite well. And then the final natural what form of mummification I wanted to show here. These are the Inca mummies that are they were Inca sacrifices, and they're found at the really high peaks of the Andes Mountains, so up over 20,000 feet, so freezing cold. And you can see how incredibly well preserved these mummies are because of that extreme cold. Again, these need to be kept in freezing environments to be able to maintain with that, to not fall out. So that's our first kind of mummification. And so again, this can happen in various places if the environmental conditions are correct. The next form of mummification, I kind of call it, it's a mixture between what we would understand as artificial mummification and natural mummification. So we can go to that next slide here. This is it's kind of a spontaneous, it's not spontaneous, but this mummification occurs in Peru, where you have a really dry desert environment, and the people of Peru recognized this, and they knew that the environment would on the coast would preserve bodies, and so they took this and incorporated into their understanding of how they wanted to bury their dead, preserve their dead, and they continue to go back and worship their dead in this ancestor worship and revisit tombs. And so, what we see here are bodies that are in a seated position and wrapped in layers and layers of textile. People were buried oftentimes with things that were really important to them, like their favorite fishing kit or the tools they used for weaving. And because of the desert, that would preserve, and these would be buried in tombs. You would often times be buried alongside of many of your ancestors, and your living relatives would come and leave food for you and offerings throughout your lifetime. And so this kind of, they knew that it's a mix between artificial, but they never used any embalming fluids or anything to actually help the body along in preservation. Now that brings us to the final form, which is artificial mummification. And this is what most people think about when they think about mummies. And we have here on the top picture the Egyptian mummy. And this is the quintessential of our understanding of mummies. Of course, the Egyptians would dry out the body. They would remove the organs. The organs would the reason they would do that is because they were extra juicy, so to speak. And so they would take them out. They would either put them in jars, or sometimes a little bit later in time, they would wrap them back. They would mummify the organs and wrap them back up and put them inside the body. You would dry out the body. You would use resins and embalming oils to make the skin kind of supple again and wrap the mummy. And so these preserve now without having to have a freezer or anything. They stay really well intact. And this is because you needed your body, and you needed it to be whole to move into the afterlife. The other mummy that you see here, the two examples, are both from what are called chinchorro mummies. And these, in fact, are started way back. These are the oldest mummies in the world, that are oldest artificial mummies in the world, I should say, 7,000 years ago. And this is from the north coast of Chile, the south coast of Peru. Like I've been talking about, it's very dry here. And these people recognize this. A different form of mummification, though. They would take the skin off the body, and they would reinforce the body with sticks and then cover it in plaster type material. And these would also stayed a part of the living lives of the parts of the lives of the living. And so the thought is go and revisit them. Sometimes they kept these in houses. So really long tradition and history of mummification in Peru as well as in ancient Egypt. So I think that now brings me to the point where we want to ask some questions, or do you want me to continue on and talk about history?
We could definitely open some questions. One thing I just really love about what you've touched on is I think you're right. A lot of the time when we think of mummies, we think of kind of white cloth wrapped bodies in ancient Egypt. And we kind of forget that other people were maybe doing it around the world, and also doing it a long time before the Egyptians ever did it, which is pretty neat. Actually, and from my end, why is that? Why are Egyptian mummies typically the most known?
I think it's mostly because of that elaborate process of mummification that the Egyptian mummies underwent. But there's also this idea of Egypt mania, right? And so actually, this will lead me into the history a little bit. And so why don't I get into that, and then we'll take some questions. I think that might be a good way of doing it. So there was a craze of Egypt mania back in the late 1800s, early 1900s, and even like a little bit before there, where people were just nuts about these Egyptian mummies. Not only are they beautiful, but the way that they're preserved, and how fascinating it was. And so they used to do these unwrapping parties to understand what was inside. And so you can see here, this is a lecture hall, very famous woman who was doing these. There's also these parties that people would bring mummies home and unwrap them. And it was kind of completely different than the way that we do things today, because this can be considered quite disrespectful. And so today we use all different kinds of other technologies, including CT scanning, which will allow us to look inside of the body without ever having to take the wrappings off of a mummy. And I'm going to talk a lot more about this later, but just recognizing that we do things very, very differently to understand the past. And that just leads me to also want to say that in general, we have a different philosophy from even 100 years ago, even 50 years ago, about not only how archaeology is conducted. And so I actually never go out with the purpose of looking for mummies. That is not the goals in my personal research. I also, in general, if there are mummies in a museum, we do whatever we possibly can to be respectful of the culture that where those mummies came from. So in terms of ancient Egyptian mummies, we look to modern Egyptian practices on not only displaying those remains, but on also how to study them and what the best way is. And doing this so that we are in line with the ethics and the values of the cultures and of the descendants of those individuals. And so, for example, we would never ever look to study Native American remains, because this is not at all what the cultures of Native North America would want us to do. And so our way that we treat mummies and the ways that we can understand from the mummies and their potential from learning really, really varies, and is really important for us as scientists to respect those varying beliefs and varying communities.
Wow, that's honestly kind of poetic and beautiful. I love kind of the lens you've given it, this like humanistic approach, because I think you're right. A lot of time we kind of forget and we get so maybe distracted by the shiny and glittery aspects of those mummies that we forget that those were actual bodies of people who lived and had lives and families and friends, and had a lot of feelings and had a whole experience outside of what we see. So I think that's a really interesting point, and I love that you made it. At this point, we'd love also to hear from our friends in the chat. So for those of you who are going to be off camera, this is a time for you to go ahead and type some of those questions in the chat, and we'll feed those to Michele in just a second. On the other hand, we have West Middle School. West Middle School, I know we did a mic check earlier. Are you going to be ready for some on-camera questions? They might be getting ready. And like I said, anyone, excuse me, anyone else who is ready to ask questions, feel free to type them in the chat as well. Otherwise, we can go ahead and get, let's see, West Middle School. There we go, perfect. Awesome.
What was the best discovery that you had?
Oh, that's a fun question. Oh man, I do like that question. So, what's interesting is I would say in general, things that probably don't seem that exciting to most people are some of the most exciting to me, because it might be something I've been studying for a really long time, and this little, really what seems like insignificant object might be like the key to break open this research question I've had. Now that's not what people want to hear. But so I have been really fortunate though, and I've had the opportunity to work on digs where we did excavate a burial that was a priestess from Peru, and she had all kinds of gold, and like she was buried in a coffin, and she had sacrificial victims and museum style ceramics, and there were all these llama sacrifices on top, and it was really amazing to be a part of that. It really is kind of like the movies. We had to excavate at night by dramatic lighting. So those types of things are not really all that common, but I would say it was something very fun to experience.
What a great question. I love that it led to this kind of unique experience and story. Thank you. Are there any other questions from West Middle School?
Yes, there are.
Okay.
Hi.
Hi.
My question is, how do people like archaeologists find mummies?
Cool. Yeah. So we if we are, this is an interesting question because sometimes we want to find mummies to know where they are so that we don't disturb them. So oftentimes we will use different techniques and technologies like ground penetrating radar, which is something that we can use to see below the surface without digging. We use other technologies for the same purpose to see below the surface, and then we know where there might be burials like this and that and the other thing. But oftentimes what we rely on is the context. And so we know, for example, if there's a pyramid behind me, there oftentimes mummies were buried in a pyramid. These have mostly been looted just because people have like taken all the stuff out of them in recent history. But that, I mean, if I'm in Peru and I know that I'm in a place that might have a pyramid, which we have them in Peru as well, that's where I can guess that there was probably a mummy in here.
All right, thank you.
Thank you.
Kind of cool. Yeah, it sounds a little bit like the storytelling story map where you're using kind of those tales to solve mysteries. So that's pretty interesting. It looks like we do have another question through West Middle School.
Yeah, so what I was wondering, does archaeology have different levels like beginner, advanced, and professional?
That's a good question. I would say that to a certain degree, yes. So, to if you are to study archaeology and you go to do your undergraduate degree, your bachelor's degree, there are opportunities to work as a crew member for some larger projects that might require someone to have an advanced level of education to direct. So for me, I have a doctorate, a PhD, and so this means that I can actually go. I come up with the research questions. I choose the sites. I decide where we're going to dig. I decide what types of things we're going to be digging for. That's because I went to school for many, many, many years to study this. But if you even just want to be a volunteer on a project, people like me or other folks, we will train you and teach you the tools and the techniques, and you can help out with that process. So there's definitely a place for a lot of different people in the discipline, and to learn and to get excited about the ancient past.
Thank you.
I love that you asked that question. In fact, because someone asked more or less the same question in the chat. They said, how can I become a mummy scientist? And Michelle, you just went ahead and answered that without even knowing.
Sure.
Let's get this last question from West Middle School, and the rest of your questions I'll have you guys hold on to until we have another Q&A later in the session. So take it away.
Hello, my question is, what was your most recent discovery?
Ooh, good question. My most recent discovery. Oh man, I've been working on this really cool project. COVID put us on hold, but as I said, I'm going to Peru. I'm going to Peru on Saturday, but for a different project. But I've been working on this project. I'm going back in July, where we are excavating murals from in a temple from a culture called the Moche culture, which lived on the north coast before the Inca. And these are these incredible murals that have been buried for 1,500 years that show again these priestesses and these warriors, and these are going to be uncovered for the first time ever. We have a grant from National Geographic to work on these. But back in 2019, before COVID, we started to do some of this work, and I got down to what I know is a floor that had paint on the floor, and I had to stop. And so I stay tuned till July, and we'll see what happens.
Thanks.
Sure.
I love these questions. Those were amazing. So yeah, West Middle School, we'll go ahead and have you put yourself on mute. Hold on to those questions. If you have anything else, we will bring them up later. I wanted to throw just two short ones from the chat. One is, do all Egyptian mummies have face coverings?
Well, that's a really good question. That's a really, really good question. Most of the Egyptian mummies, so basically, if you had money in ancient Egypt, you could be mummified. And the goal was everyone would love to have been, but it was an expensive industry. It was very expensive to do that. And so we see varying levels of mummification depending on almost the like wealth of individuals. But there's also a lot of mummification variation through time. In ancient Egypt, there's 3,000 years of history of mummification. And so this is good. There's going to be a lot of variation. You do start to see these cartouches, which are that paper mache masks that are put on mummies, a lot more during the later time periods of mummification, but you see them in royal mummies as well. So a lot of the pharaohs had them a lot earlier. So I think there's variation, but they became a little more standard in that later period of mummification, kind of like I would say a, a couple hundred years BC rather than thousands of years BC.
Okay, so maybe they got into the practice, they found what they liked, and what was that word again? What a
Cartouche.
cartouche, what a vocabulary word. So that's amazing. Very cool. All right, last question from the chat, and then we'll go ahead and jump into our next segment. How many mummies have been found in the world? Do you have a ballpark number?
I don't honestly, because there have just been so many. And I mean, if we're talking about everything from these like natural, spontaneous ones to the artificial, ancient Egyptian, and like I said, where I don't know if I said this, but where I work in Peru, there's like so many as well. I couldn't give you a number. I mean, there's just a lot.
I guess, I mean, if you think about the history of humanity and animals, and you did mention that not just humans get mummified, it can sometimes naturally happen to animals as well, which I guess would mean there could be a lot of bodies out there, isn't there?
Yes.
So very cool. All right, well, let's go ahead. We're gonna open Q&A later in the session as well. But Michele, if you want to go ahead and take it away, I think you're going to be telling us a little bit more about Egypt. Am I right?
Yes. So I wanted to talk a bit more about ancient Egypt, mostly because, well, I guess there's two reasons. I was fortunate enough to just go to Egypt. I was there in January for my first time ever there. And man, as an archaeologist, that's like, whoa, this is really cool. But we also have an exhibit here at the Denver Museum of Nature and Science on ancient Egypt. So I thought I would talk a little bit more about it. And I wanted, because I think it's important to understand that ancient Egyptians, and like I said, even before that in the Chinchorro, practiced mummification for a really, really long time period, 3,000 years, and it changed dramatically over time. Not only the techniques that were used and the way that the bodies were preserved, but also where bodies were buried. And so in sort of the earlier time periods, I'll talk about the kings, the pharaohs were buried in pyramids, and everyone thinks Egypt, but these were about 2600 BC is when we really first start to see the pyramids. And I wanted to put up here the progression of pyramid construction, so that we kind of take it off the table that aliens came down and just built the pyramids, because the ancient Egyptians were experimenting for generations on how to build these and build them properly. So you can see the top one with the camel, that's the first pyramid in Egypt, and it was a step pyramid because that was the technology that they worked with. And then they said the next one down, and the one also behind me, this is called the bent pyramid. This pharaoh was like, I want one with straight edges, but their builders didn't quite get it, and so they got to a certain point, it's like, oh, gotta change the angle, and it turned out bent. He didn't like it, so he had them build the next one up in the corner here, and that's called the red pyramid, a very red picture. This is the first true pyramid. And then after that, you get these pyramids that we think of, the ones from Giza. So this long progression. But then pyramid building kind of stopped. And 1,000 years later, people started making these rock cut tombs. And these are the tombs of the New Kingdom mummies, or New Kingdom pharaohs that so many of you have heard of, like King Tut and Ramses the Second. They weren't built; they were buried in pyramids. They were buried in these tombs that were cut into the side of this valley, the Valley of the Kings. And you can see here going down deep into one of these tombs. Another thing about ancient Egypt that's really interesting is how much reuse there was of these tombs. And like I was saying, most of the pyramids, all of them are pretty much have been looted. The pharaohs have been taken out. We don't know where they are. In terms of the New Kingdom, a lot of them were looted in the past. Many of the kings were moved into different, all like put away in one of these tombs. And so we actually have a lot of those pharaohs, their bodies, but they weren't in their original place. And so when I was there, this is was really exciting. I got to go into the tomb of this I would say of this prince that was reused in this tomb is from the New Kingdom time period, and then it was reused about 600 years later, and with a whole bunch of other coffins were buried, or individuals were buried in there. And you can see I have an arrow here on one coffin that says Mez, because this coffin ended up in the Denver Museum of Nature and Science. And we discovered this through a long process. This tomb was excavated in 1903 by Italians, and they shipped this coffin over. They said they left it for some American museum to have, and we ended up with it here. But it has a mummy in it, or it came with a mummy that was brought here at the same time, that didn't belong to that particular that was not Mez's mummy. It was a mummy of a female. So lots of mixing up was happening. Lots of things were to make it quite confusing of how we understand the ancient past, because people have been kind of destroying things for a long time. Another one quick video I did want to show you too is, so this was a really cool experience from that New Kingdom tombs, but I also got to go into one of these tombs, and I'll let the video kind of talk about it rather than me.
Hi everyone, Dr. Michele Koons from the Denver Museum of Nature and Science, and I am inside King Tut's tomb in the Valley of the Kings in Egypt. And here you can see some of the incredible paintings inside this tomb behind me. This is a part of the Book of the Dead with baboons, and you can see one of the sarcophagi that was in this tomb. Many of the other ones are in the National Museum that's in Cairo, and King Tut himself is actually still in this tomb right over here. You can see right behind me. There he is. Pretty incredible experience. This tomb was discovered exactly 100 years ago by Howard Carter, and it's incredible to be here 100 years later and inside.
So that was really, really, really cool. And I do want to mention that the reason King Tut was one of the only pharaohs that was found intact in his tomb, and that's why he's so famous. And that tomb was found, not, well, I guess a little bit recently, so to speak. So we have all of those materials, and that's one of the only tombs that's like that. And that's why he's so famous. All the other ones had been looted in what we would call in antiquity a really long time ago. But right now I want to turn to and talk about some of the technology a little bit more in depth of what we use to study these, to study mummies. So we have mummies in our museum here that came over to the United States in the early 1900s, and it's our responsibility to really make sure we take care of these, and I think doing that to understand them better. And so we took them to Children's Hospital, which is we had to take them on an ambulance ride, very slow, and did some CAT scans, so CT scans, to basically be able to virtually unwrap and see what's inside, to tell the story of these individuals a little bit better than maybe has been told before, and to really give them that respect that they deserve. And so you can see here on the screen, this is us looking at the mummy inside the CAT scan and seeing inside of it for the first time, and all of the different layers, whatnot that's in there. And then here is the reconstructions we can make, where we can virtually unwrap that mummy. We took off this outer layer. Now we're going down inside. You can see in here, there are these kind of bundly looking things in the middle. Those are actually the bundles where organs were removed, dried out and then put back into the body. And this was a practice that happened a little bit later in history because of all this looting I was talking about. That originally were putting these organs in these jars, and then people were taking the jars, and you needed your whole body to go to the afterlife. So they had to start putting them back inside. Looking, you can see the brain is gone in this shot. Again, you can see those organs. You can see the heart scarab on top in blue that was sitting over top of the heart, which was left inside the body. We're going to have another view here, really excellent, of the heart scarab. She also has false eyes, these bundles inside of the inside of the body, and you can see these little red figures in here. And these are all wax figures, and we'll get a better view of these, but they are attached to the organ bundles, and they can help us understand. Each one of these wax figures are represent the four sons of Horus, which protect different organs. And we can now know what organ is what because we can see these wax figures and recognize how they match up. And you can see here is a picture of what they look like. So really amazing that we're able to learn all this without doing any harm to the body. And we were able to learn a lot more about these mummies in terms of how old they are. We know that both of the mummies we have here are female, and this is all trying to rewrite that history, rewrite that story in the most respectful way.
Wow, what a wild experience. I love from a scientific aspect the amount of clarity that we're able to see in these mummified bodies, but I'm sure it must have just been so surreal for you and for this nursing staff to have this several thousand-year-old body come in where they normally see children, right?
Totally. It was really crazy. We had to do it at 2 a.m. as well because we didn't want to take the machine from people who needed it. So it was even more surreal.
That is wild. Just goes to show you just how much it takes for good science to happen. Well, at this point, Michelle, I think we're ready to open up the chat for a couple more questions. And so before I call on you, West Middle School, because I know that you probably have a few more questions, I do want to start with a few I saw in the chat. So first and foremost, you briefly touched on this, but why did they make mummies? People who have intentionally created them, why do they make mummies?
Mummies, every time we see that artificial mummification, it has to do with religion. And so it would be different depending on where you are in the world. So the purposes behind it change if you're in Peru versus Egypt. But for example, in Egypt, you needed to have your body full and intact so you could go into the afterlife because there's a whole myth, and it's a long story, and I encourage you to look it up, the myth of Osiris, and how your body has to your soul is in two parts, and one part of your soul travels through the afterworld at night, and it has to come back to your body every day. And so you had to physically have that as part of religious underpinnings. And that same goes for in Peru too. It's all about that ancestor worship, and so having the physical bodies there to worship is something to go back to.
Very cool. Well, this kind of, I guess, is relevant to the next question then. If we're talking about kind of how we think about like the spirit or the story of these mummies, what can you tell us about mummy curses and the rumor and the story of kind of traps and things in pyramids and mummy curses?
Well, I don't know if there's any real. There may be curses around some of them. I will note though that the pyramids. I did have the opportunity to go into the Great Pyramid, and it was a series of kind of traps and mazes because they didn't want people to find the mummy that was in there. That was the pharaoh, especially the big one. The pharaoh, his name was Khufu. They didn't want him to be found, so there was a series of kind of like booby traps, so to speak. So I think that that's a lot where the story came from. Unfortunately, people did find him, and this was way before we have any record of that. So he was taken. We don't know where he ended up. But so I think that some of the myth of the curse of the mummy kind of there's like a bit of reality in that, in the original intentions of some of the ancient Egyptians in trying to hide those bodies.
Interesting. All right. So very cool. There you have it. So maybe not so much of a curse as a really unfortunate way of getting lost when you're trying to maybe conduct science or feel something you shouldn't have your hands on. Last question from the chat, and then we'll turn over to West Middle School for a couple more questions. What was your first discovery or excavation? Do you remember maybe what your first excavation was?
I do. My first excavation, I guess, where I got kind of the bug that, bit me that I kept going, was in upstate New York, actually, and on the Iroquois. I don't know if folks are familiar with the Iroquois, and had the opportunity to excavate in a longhouse that was one of the houses that the Iroquois lived in, and there were two sites, and one was a pre-European contact and one was a post-European contact, and we got to compare how those settlements changed through after that contact with Europeans. And it was really interesting seeing the introduction of flint and items for guns and stuff like that. So it was pretty fascinating.
Cool. I love that it wasn't even someplace outside of our country. It just goes to show how much science and culture there is to discover right here at home. All right, so it looks like West Middle School, we've got a question ready. Take it away.
Do you find a lot of mummies a year?
Oh, sorry. Where? In here?
Do you find a lot of mummies every year?
Do I? No, I don't. I don't actually go out to explicitly find mummies. It's not actually a part of my major research questions when I going out and doing my archaeological work. So no, I don't. And actually I don't really like finding them very much because I think that if they're still in the ground, it's kind of a good thing to leave them there. And if they're not in the ground, then we have opportunities to understand better and to understand what we should do with them based on what that host culture thinks. But yeah, so I would say no. I have found them, but that is not, like I said, my main goal.
Cool, very interesting. Like I said, I love that kind of different perspective. It's really refreshing and kind of highlights how maybe archaeology has changed. Do we have any other West Middle School questions? We have time for maybe one more. Hi there. Go ahead. You can ask your question.
Has there ever been a time when someone dropped or broke a mummy?
Oh yeah, I'm sure. Yes, yes. I don't even need to say I think this has happened. I'm sure it's happened. It's just unfortunate. So I don't have any specific examples right now, but these can be very fragile.
Yeah, I guess when we're thinking about that mummy's curse, maybe that's when we start to really worry about it, isn't it? Don't drop any bodies.
Yeah.
So, actually, I love, thank you, by the way, West Middle School. Those were some great questions. I love that came up. We don't have, unfortunately, much time left, but there is kind of one question I think we'd like to leave you guys with to take away and think about in your classrooms after we hang up our call. And you can see it's on the screen. But ultimately, archaeology first became kind of really popular. It was really rooted in this idea of treasure hunting, finding artifacts, the glittery, cool things that we put on display in museums and sent to collectors, things that Michele said, maybe just really aren't the focus of archaeology anymore and isn't super respectful for bodies and people who belong to them. So I want you to think about in your classrooms, how does changing our perspective, how do kind of changing how we approach studying cultures benefit the study of archaeology? How does it benefit all people and not just scientists? I'm hoping some of you become archaeologists someday. So what are things you would like to see in archaeology as we continue learning and exploring and having a lot of fun and things as we're doing it, but also how do we respect the people that we are studying in turn? So teachers, guardians, whoever you're watching with, I would hope that afterwards you guys get to facilitate and really talk about this because I think it is an important question. Michele, anything you want to leave our students with today?
I think, I mean, we're pretty good. I want to just say thank you all for joining me in this. And I just, want to go back to that understanding of how much my discipline has changed, and how we are really thinking a lot about what it is to be human, and what does that mean, and what are our responsibilities for caring for the people who came before us, but also the opportunities that we have to learn from them, and how that can make us better. And so it's really this, going back and forth, these two things coming together about the respect and the vast amount of knowledge that those who came before can share with us. And so it's very exciting to be engaged in this thinking. So thank you all for allowing me to share some with you.
And thank you for taking the time to share it with us. I really hope to see some of you here at the museum soon, if not just visiting, maybe becoming an archaeologist yourself. It sounds like there's a couple ways that you can get involved, whether it's school or just seeking out digs and volunteering and learning as you go. So really, really neat. Thank you again for joining us. We were thrilled to have you. We will have another session, in fact, next month. So if we could cue that last slide, perfect. If you enjoyed today's virtual field trip, we have another one on May 5th. Not about mummies, though they are pretty interesting, obviously, to talk about. This one will be with Dr. James Hagedorn, and we will be taking you into kind of the bowels of the museum, opening cabinets and drawers and looking at all the rocks, gems, and minerals that we don't have on display for the public. So if you enjoyed today, please tune in with us next month. Otherwise, have a really good one, you guys, and we'll see you next time. Bye.
Bye.